welcome everybody. Good morning. Welcome to the last day of the Phacilitate meeting in Miami this year. To add to the discussions that are going on over the last few days, we have decided to run a breakfast briefing and want to touch on some of the topics that have to do with the steady growing market of cell and gene therapy and the raw materials needed for that. My name is Frank Hecht. I'm the moderator of this session. I'm the Vice President Marketing and Sales with CellGenix, a German company that is manufacturing and distributing raw materials for cell and gene therapy. We have a panel together today that will discuss some of the challenges and some of the possibilities according to raw materials. You can see the panel over here. They will come to the stage in a minute. But to get things started, we have Stefano Bala, who most of you know already, but I would like to ask him to introduce himself, who will give a short kickoff presentation about some of the thoughts about raw materials. So Stefano, please.
Thank you, Frank, and thanks to CellGenix for the invitation and to organize a wonderful breakfast, not only for the food, so thank you again, but also for the content. In fact, the raw material is becoming more and more an area of attention for developer of cell and gene therapy products. And well, I will say myself and the company that I represent today, Anemocyte, we're pretty much well aware of that. Anemocyte is a contract manufacturing organization, so we're facing all the challenge of the manufacturing for all the products that come into our arena. And most recently, we also ended up facing some of the raw material challenge also as a producer, because we start to manufacture also plasmid as a raw material for viral vector production. So what I did try to do in the slide that you will see here shortly is really more to provide some food for thought to continue the discussion later on with the panelists, of course, but we all hope to have a lot of interaction also with you as attendees. So without any further ado, I just go to the first slide. So I decided to start with this cartoon. It was developed starting from a picture that was published in 2016, a paper from the TLA Lodge. This couple of authors have put together a very interesting review in the last 3-4 years on especially from a regulatory perspective, what's happening in Europe. And what is interesting to me in this slide is not only that it summarizes more or less all the steps that you have to keep in account when you are thinking of manufacturing a product, but I think it will correlate with something that we often heard, that is every time you start with the production or with developing a product, you should start with the end in mind, right? So you should already foresee how your product will look like in the context of the population you want to treat. So in theory, you should be able to, since day one, put an hypothesis on each of these words and replace with what you expect it to be at the end of the road. As a reality, you know, when you start, that's an extremely hard job. And especially for raw material, we say often is an area that is neglected up to a point that, you know, you say, well, I can start using this raw material that my neighbor in the other lab is using. He will probably give him for free. They will publish together, etc. So that's, of course, it's a common way to think when you are in academia and you try to, you know, leverage your friend, let's say. But as a reality, become a reason of complexity when you want to develop a proper product. Before entering into more details, what I thought it was important to share here is that there are some minor differences between Europe and US when you talk about raw material. Raw material from a European perspective is an active substance that enters in contact with the product, but is not supposed to be then present in the final product. On the other hand, starting material is something that you will have in the presence of your production since the beginning, but still will be part of the active substance that will come at the end. In US, as I said, it's slightly different. Raw material really means everything that comes in contact with the drug that is going to come, and the equivalence of European raw material is more or less the ancillary material. Now it's a very simple overview. You can look into the related pharmacopoeia chapter here to enter into more details. But in the next slide, I will refer always to ancillary material so that we all refers to the same thing. Another thing that I thought it was important to mention during the slide here is that you will look at the raw material probably from different perspectives depending on what is your role. So, of course, the developer is the key person, but there are other two players that might enter into play. There is the ancillary material supplier, and then on the other end, often there are also CMO, so it's a third-party entity that will have the responsibility to manufacture your product. So depending on who you are, you might have a different perspective, feeling, and understanding perhaps of the ancillary material. But regardless, it's very important to say that the person or the entity that is responsible for the choice of the raw material or ancillary material is the final user. So it is up to the developer to really make sure that the raw material is of a suitable quality to be used to continue the manufacturing. As I mentioned before, often when you start, you have you are not in a position to be really holistic in the way you look at your production, and often raw material is not keeping account as much as it should, simply because it enters really in all the critical moment of the development of the drugs. And by changing raw material or modifying them, you can really impact the quality of the product up to impacting the potency and perhaps even have a different product at the end of the manufacturing. So it's very critical really to think of the raw material. In order to do that, the developer are called to use a risk-based assessment. I mean, the ECH guideline provides some suggestion on how you can do that. But what is very important is I often use the term fit for the purpose. That is something more common maybe in the QC world, but it's really important that you identify the best raw material that is adapted to perform the manufacturing you have in mind. Another key element here is that GMP is not easy to define in the context of raw material. In fact, unless you're going to put into the game something that is an API or a drug product, you will not have a GMP label as a product that is released to be used in human, right? So what the provider of raw material have to do is to decide where to put the bar and go up to basically produce at the same level of a drug and then provide all the elements that are critical to characterize your product. I have another couple of slides here that I think are quite important in context of what we are saying. So there are two keywords that I read the first time in 2015. That is manufacturability and sustainability when we refer to the manufacturing of cells. Manufacturability means, can I manufacture my product, basically? But that's not enough. I mean, is that sustainable, then the manufacturing strategy I have in mind? And that refers also to the logistic, the cost of goods, and of course, efficacy, and at the end of the day, the capacity also to get reimbursement for what I'm manufacturing. If you look into that, and you look one step further down, you will realize that there are a lot of elements that can generate a voice of cost. So it's not only the manufacturing, something that ended up adding number to the cost of your product, but there is also aspects such as, bad quality. If you have to throw away a batch because the quality is not right, that's a cost. This cost like the compliance, right? Very similar to what I just mentioned, but more from a regulatory perspective, the cost of in and out of the product. And then, all the cost of capital that goes behind that. So when we talk about raw material, I often ended up being in tables where there is a discussion between procurement and quality, and the idea is, can we save on raw material? And, if you've ever been in a table like that, often the reaction of quality and regulatory people towards who want to save on cost of goods is very similar to the one of these kids. So they are not very easy conversation, but at the end, I mean, the reality is that there's no cost on quality, and that's something we all have to face. So the highest quality is always what is required. What is very important to say is that if you look just from this simple perspective, there's no way to have saving, if you want, from a raw material perspective. But let's not forget that the raw material is not an island in the middle of the ocean. It's a concept that goes within, embedded with the entire manufacturing process. So in the last 2 slides, I would like to share with you some of the thoughts that have been generated in the past 3 years of an event that was organized by the Phacilitate, actually. It's called Automation SIG. It's a special interest group that is really focusing its time on the concept of automation. And every year they provide a report of it. So I collect the last 3 years report and I review a little bit of the comments around raw material and ancillary material. And here is what I found. And I think it well fit with what I mentioned in the slide before. So there's a lot of interest from the user to have a solution in terms of material that can fit with the workflow. So how can I make sure that I can get raw material that can be easily be integrated in my manufacturing strategy? Of course, as I mentioned, the key element is GMP compliant. So define where is my bar to define what GMP is and what sort of support I can get from the provider of this material. At the end of the day, if you work well with an element like raw material, that is basically what you use every day to manufacture your product, you might be in a position where you can reduce the labor, maybe be in a position where you can reduce the potential risk of do mistake and bring failure. And of course, if you can help the process to be fully closed by find solution to make the input of your raw material during the production, that might allow even to work in lower clean room. So now we move from a situation where the raw material is an area where you cannot save anything to maybe an area where if you are creative and if you collaborate with the provider, you might have several areas that will allow you to save cost, time, people. So those are some of the ideas I've seen, and some additional, which I think are quite relevant to mention here, is also refers to the supplier. So as I mentioned, GMP, it's a target that is difficult to achieve in terms of label from authority unless you manufacture a drug product, but there are other quality systems that allow to make sure that the production is certified, such as ISO method, for example. But what's very important is that the supplier really provide qualified methods or way to define the consistency, defining specification of your product, and additional point of support. I mean, I'm thinking personally, I did benefit a lot from receiving stability data on a specific product when I was working on CAR-T. So there's a lot of aspects that are relevant for the manufacturing process that you can only achieve if you can start a very close collaboration with your supplier that you have to trust is your partner in crime, let's say. So my hope is that today there will be interaction on some of the topics that I mentioned here. I think we put together a list of questions that you find here that can be the starting point of some of the discussion here with the panel. But once again, I really hope to hear a lot from you. So I hope I was able to keep you awake, even if it's an early morning. And well, the excitement is starting now in a minute. So be prepared to ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. I just woke up when you said that you were hoping to keep us awake, so I hope the presentation was good. No, I think it was a good presentation that gave a good segue into the plenary discussion we're going to have now, because it was lining out already a lot of the thoughts about raw materials. With this, I would like to ask the other members of the panel to join us here on stage. To make it easier for you, we have aligned them according to the slides, so you already know who is here and who is speaking at one point in time. Thank you. To get things started off, I would like to ask a quick round to see individually from your perspective, from your background, your experience in the industry, your position you hold right now, what is the most challenging thought about raw materials that comes to mind? And answering this, I would also like to introduce yourself quickly, who you are, what affiliation you have, and what is your interest in cell and gene therapy. Stefano, you want to start? Introduction can be short for yourself.
Still Stefano Bala, the Director of Operational and Business Development of Anemocyte. As mentioned, we are mainly a contract manufacturing organization. I would say that for us, the major challenge, there are two, but they are very related. One is, of course, the customer, as a contract manufacturer. You want first to have all the introduction?
No, introduce yourself and answer the question, and we go through. Okay,
very briefly, it's on one hand the customer, because it's difficult for them to understand the challenges that are behind the raw material. And I would say from a regulatory perspective, there's often lack of clarity on the raw material level.
Mm-hmm. So I'm Jon Ellis. I'm a cell therapy manager at Invetech. Invetech is an engineering company focused on the development of commercial scale cell therapy automation manufacturing solutions. And for us, I think standardization around connectivity can be quite an issue to make sure we can maintain closed systems.
Thank you.
Jef Pinxteren, former VP Operations, Promotera Biosciences in Belgium, now independent consultant. I have a strength in process development, and from recent history, challenges that I remember are the regional differences, the requirements for compliance GMP, the differences between US, Europe, Japan can be a headache. And also, I think what we always forget is that communication between the parties can solve a lot of problems.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
My name is Bernd Leistler. I'm Vice President Production at CellGenix. Our responsibilities include the GMP production of the cytokines and process development of new cytokines, including innovative packaging solutions. So, biggest challenge, maintaining quality at increasing demands, and I should mention standardization of products, product formats, having in mind that the processes out on the market now are very diverse, at a very diverse state of development, so that calls for multitude of solutions from our side.
Thank you very much. And I think when you look at these four answers, there's some topics already pretty obvious that we also see in everyday discussions. It's connectivity. How do I connect stuff to each other? It's not only the raw materials to a machine, but also connecting it worldwide if you work with a CMO. So if you want to go into that discussion a little bit more, that would be something that would be interesting. Also, the worldwide use we just discussed, regulatory-wise, support-wise, supply-wise. So I think these are some of the main issues. And we have two examples of raw materials right here, cytokines and cell culture media, which are being used in almost every cell therapy. So what are your thoughts on the connectivity issues? How can we overcome the different standards or the different approaches in the market right now?
Well, I think right now there is there are two situations where you might want to, you might end up working in a very customized solution, even if, of course, it will be much easier to have something that is more standard from a cost perspective, from a capability to really help out the customer. Of course, it's not only the provider or the raw material at that point, it's also the supplier of all the bioreactors, closed elements that enter into the manufacturing that have to be part of the discussion. I think something we have seen at the SIG in the past. Defining the storage condition of the product, the how to connect will be a door, a stereo connector device or something. Those are all the elements that the industry have to line on a little bit, and again, perhaps also regulator should help out. But really, understanding the process is probably the best way to start to address this challenge.
What are your thoughts on this?
I think just to reinforce that really, I think collaboration in the industry is critical, especially when you can be obtaining your raw materials from a whole range of different vendors, tube sets from different vendors, and making sure that whatever solution you have is truly plug and play. So tubing connects to each other. If you're using aseptic connectors that one company's aseptic connector can play with another's, it seems quite simple stuff, but can really cause a massive problem when kind of developing an end-to-end manufacturing solution.
It's because the manufacturers, of course, they think their system is the best, and they would like you to use their stuff. But of course, for the cell therapy manufacturer, it's a nightmare, as you say, because you have one good back system and then a bioreactor, and you can't, connect them. Maybe a company will step up and make all the parts to then connect the different connectors, but that would be crazy. I mean, it's the same situation as with the iPhone charger and all that. So yeah.
Yeah, I haven't much to add. I mean, it calls for some kind of harmonization between the raw material suppliers and the instrument providers to have kind of a set of standardized formats that can be easily attached and that maintains a kind of flexibility to the user.
Yeah, thank you. And also I would say, Jon, with Invetech, you're probably running into these problems all the time when you talk to your partners trying to set up processes. So how did you overcome these issues with your partners in actual real-life setups?
It varies from time to time depending on the client and their process. I would say it's just a constant challenge. There is no easy solution to the problem. Right now we're just really trying to harmonize things like tubing construction, diameters of tubing, so at least you can use one standard connection across the manufacturing process, but that's not to say that that same solution will be applicable for every single client process. So it's just an ongoing challenge, and it really can take up quite a lot of time to solve the problem, and also for the end user to having to develop an efficient manufacturing process, not wasting all their time trying to figure out how to connect from A to B. There are enough complexities in manufacturing without introducing ones that really seem quite avoidable.
And Stefano, Jef, have you run into these issues in the past in your manufacturing capacities? And what was the solution for that? Was it all customized then, or did you come up with something that could be used as a standard or as an idea for a standard?
Well, I think Jef brought up a point that sometimes is really the user that have to find a way to make it possible to connect two ends, find something in between. So let's say an adapter. So you might ended up searching on the web for some adapting solution. What I noticed, I think is quite interesting, that the cell therapy developed mainly from the hospital experience. So there's a lot of PVC that comes from the world. On the other end, a lot of the solution that comes from the provider come more from the biological world, and that's more C-flex-based or other kind of tubing. So now that the two worlds are melting a little bit, there's a problem because the two kind of tubing don't talk. So it's not that easy to find a solution, I will say, if not homemade.
But as I said, communication is important, and most of the suppliers are of course willing to help, because in the end they want you to remain the customer. So one example is, for instance, the company supplying media in a particular bag with particular tubing then did a custom production for us so that we could connect up the media bags to the system we wanted. So that's an example. Of course, it's costly. Would be better if it was standardized, but I understand that not every system works for every situation. One cell likes a particular type of plastic, another one doesn't. So, but if we can reduce it to a limited number of combinations, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, and that's also what Phacilitate is trying with that special interest group automation that we just pointed out earlier through Stefano. Trying to move ahead with these standardizations, or at least with some good suggestions what to use and how to use it. Because we see that there's a lot of issues coming up with tube diameters, as you mentioned, stereo connectors and all that. And the connectivity issue is not only limited to your lab itself, but it's also, and this goes into the next topic we just said, it goes into the global use also of a certain raw material, because you might be starting out in your lab, in your company, in your manufacturing site, but you want to branch out to a CMO. you want to branch out to your location in Asia, your location in Europe, something like that. So do you have any experiences with that or any suggestions with that, to have that global uniformity available and availability of raw materials that fit into your system?
Well, my personal experience is very much linked to the communication with the provider and also an assessment of the provider itself. So the capability of a provider to give material that are suitable and compliant with all the requirements of the local application. They can provide locally the reagent, the proper support, the documentation to be used there, and of course, eventually also cover license, because let's not forget that sometimes specific licenses are required, and that is something that will be useful if the provider can make it available for you, and all the information that come with that, the proper package, I would say.
You're talking about import license into a certain country, or?
Yes. Well, that, and sometimes is really, it happened to it on a very specific subset of cytokine. It was a license issue, so it was necessary to make sure that the provider have the IP or the right to give the cytokine away in that specific location.
Yeah, okay.
And I think as well, if raw material providers are not available in some of the jurisdictions where you want to manufacture, then some degree of transparency so that equivalents can be used where appropriate. Mm-hmm. So making sure that you have got second source vendors, alternative vendor capabilities, where you're operating in those different jurisdictions, because no raw materials providers can operate, or very few will operate worldwide.
Yeah, that's true. And differences between the requirements by the regulators, of course, they cannot be avoided because they are sometimes linked to the region. Just thinking about adventitious agents, Japan is different than Europe, of course. But that means that testing kits are designed and developed for the region. And if you want to work global, in some cases, I remember we had to have something tested 3 times with a different kit so that we can use it worldwide. So there's still a lot of work to do, and sometimes there is no incentive by these companies that make the kits to make something global, because there is maybe only 1 or 2 customers that would buy it, and there would be hundreds buying it regional. I can think of other examples where we were the only one using a particular strength of a raw material. It was also the only GMP compliant one. They had another product in another strength, was not GMP compliant, so they stopped making the strength we needed. And then suddenly we were only left with the other strength that was non-compliant. So what do you do then? It's very simple things can create complexity.
I can only agree. Raw material suppliers have the possibility to provide customized solutions, but the more customized it gets, the more expensive it gets. So you can only achieve extremely low prices with mass solutions. This is to consider if the intent is to drive down the COGS.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, what you said. And I think, Jef, you also posed an interesting question that you have to make sure that the product is available worldwide, ideally, and that you have a supplier that's able to provide you with material worldwide. And I know there are some other suppliers in the room here, and some of them are able to do that. And you want to make sure that you stay with the same raw materials worldwide if possible, because that saves you a lot of time and money. Another big question that is coming up more and more is the more the market matures, maturing is probably too soon, but the more the market develops, the demand is going up dramatically. Mm-hmm. So what are your strategies? You already heard second supplier. What are your strategies to make sure you have enough supply of whatever raw material it is when you need it, in the quality you need it?
Well, I think for us what has been always very useful is to be able to have quality agreement in place, mm-hmm. and including also forecast as much as possible. That allowed somehow also to maybe avoid problem like the one described from Jef, that suddenly you stop to have your product. But also I think that the forecast is something that help also the find the provider to plan around. Of course, forecasts are often wrong. That's a reality. But I think it's, I mean, being honest and transparent upfront, saying, okay, if the idea I'm developing is becoming a real drug, then suddenly I will need much more. Can you help me out with that? Yes, no, and eventually, as you said, I think the second supplier is often, perhaps unfortunately, the best plan B in case the first one cannot fulfill everything.
I think stability of the raw materials is obviously very important. Very short shelf lives plus an unknown demand is a recipe for a disaster. So the more stability data that we have on raw materials, clearly the easier it's going to be able to store enough raw material to at least deal with some of the peaks and troughs of demand as you start to understand what commercial scale manufacturing looks like.
Yeah. Sometimes there is no second supplier. Yeah. And if it's a small company, then there is a risk. Communication, as I said, can help. You can tell these people, like, look, I'm going to need 10 times or 100 times more in the coming years. That's at least a good start, but then you have to start thinking, should I move to a larger company who can supply an alternative product? It's a bit against innovative small companies, but they have to realize that they have to be ready for success. And I recommend all of them start thinking global and not making a product just for Europe or US, but start it immediately that it's globally accepted. It will help.
So second supplier would be the first thing I would mention in an ideal world. But we all know this is unrealistic, even more if we are talking about customization. So the solution, build a trustful relationship with your supplier, talk about your forecasts, be it realistic or be it wrong, but keep interaction with the supplier so he can or we can be prepared for increasing demand. This makes a picture as a whole for us, finally to invest, to grow, and to provide more capacity.
Correct. And Stefano, you said something in the beginning where you said that you would say that it's up to you to give a good forecast to a supplier so they know exactly what to manufacture. But what would be what you would expect from a supplier to make sure that your demand is met and your criteria are met?
Well, I guess the expectation is, of course, what people say, to get what I want when I want, no? which is, of course, unrealistic and perhaps just a full dream as of today. I think the expectation, I mean, being more frank, is that there's a willingness to talk and act, addressing the request, whether it's a forecast or something similar, simply because we realize that right now, as you said, the market is not so mature that a single customer can perhaps have the value that will really shift completely your decision, right? So, for example, I don't know if you would have developed this just upon one of my requests. Maybe you would have started to think about that. I mean, unless it's a big pharma, that's the reality. I mean, most of the cell therapy developers are small players, right? Mm-hmm. So I think perhaps it's important to feel considered. Perhaps that's the right wording, and see that there is a possibility to perhaps build together something, even if we're not maybe the Novartis or the Gilead.
Yeah. So what do the others think about the manufacturers, the suppliers? What should we do, and what is your expectation to us to make things easier?
So I think just in the way that you'd want your clients to let you know their forecast, I think the reverse is also true, to understand your capacity. Mm-hmm. And if you are running into supply issues of components of raw materials, to just be open, transparent, honest as soon as you possibly can be, just to try and find a sustainable solution.
Well, you expect from your supplier the highest quality for the lowest price, but as Stefano said, most cell therapy companies are still relatively small players. You cannot expect the same price or privileges that a big customer like Big Pharma has. If you were to give an example, I mean, I've helped companies going xeno-free, but if you want to test a new serum lot, it depends how many bottles you're going to buy to see what you have on choice. Sometimes there's only 2 or 3 lots available for you because they know you're only going to buy 500 bottles. So you have to be creative and innovative there, but the expectation is, of course, that you get the same treatment as the big boys. But it's not always possible.
Well, I'm not talking about maintaining safety and quality and providing all the information on that, like stability. This is a must, of course. But what I can imagine and what we see, we get different kinds of questions and requests, and we talking to a lot of customers that try to find solutions. So I think we can be and should be in the situation to propose solutions that the users might not think of in terms of connectivity, in terms of be it specified premixture of certain reagents and things like that, he might not think of. It's difficult. It goes into customization again, but it could be helpful if it's economically feasible.
And that's a good point that we just heard from Bernd here, that many suppliers are open to entertain these discussions about customized solutions, about special manufacturing batches. But on the other hand, if we are going close to a GMP standard, there's a lot of paperwork, a lot of QC, a lot of regulatory effort involved in that. So it's not just like in a research market where you just put a few bottles in manufacturing and then you give it to somebody. So there's a different mechanic behind all this and makes it difficult on both ends sometimes for us and for our partners to find good solutions here. I would like to circle back to one point that we touched quickly earlier, and that also came up with the discussion here. How do you secure supply to make your therapy stable and foolproof? Foolproof is also something that you want to make your process itself. So we discussed that over the last days and over the last meetings. How can raw materials assist you in making your process as foolproof as possible? We talked about cost of failure, which Stefano had in his presentation already, and that's something that many times is forgotten if you just look at the standard pricing of a certain product that you buy, raw material or something else, an instrument. You look at the standard operating cost, but many people tend to forget really the cost of failure and the amount of failed batches that are avoided by using a certain quality, a certain instrument, a certain something. So what's your approach on that?
Well, there are 2 aspects here, in my opinion. One aspect is, we always have a strong quality assurance eye on the supplier, because what is very important is, of course, that the supplier have in place all the elements to guarantee no difference between lot to lot. So the product that we have to receive, it should be equivalent always. And so our expectation, as you said, is that the production is made equivalent to a GMP, so that we can be assured on the kind of material that we get. On the other hand, well, to be foolproof, you have to be in a position where the fool doesn't have to do anything. So the best will be something that you just stereo connect, perhaps neither push a button, and it goes on its own. So if you can limit the opportunity for human error, the more you can, the better it is, of course. And most likely, the process will also benefit from that in terms of sustainability, but also keep it more under control.
Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of it comes down to understanding your process. So when you use raw materials, you understand at what point does your process fall over a certain concentration of cytokine or other components. So you really try and step away from that precipice in terms of the composition in your manufacturing. And as Stefano said, obviously introducing automation and connectivity that is standardized just helps de-risk the whole process. So I don't think there's kind of one particular item that solves a problem. It's just a combination of high quality raw materials, ease of connectivity, and a manufacturing process that's simple for the operator.
Many companies wait long with making the final changes to their manufacturing process for commercialization, and then they also then wait long for making it foolproof. So they keep making changes. Of course, they learn lessons, but it was discussed in other roundtables too that the longer you wait, of course, the more expensive it gets. So recommend to do it early. But so making it foolproof only becomes on the table when you think this is the process that I will go for commercialization, or at least phase 3, I mean late stage development. So which means that it's sort of, it's not done in early stages, the making it foolproof. And then you have high levels of failure. And you don't understand the high levels of failure because you think I'm still changing the manufacturing process, I will look at that later. So that's a risk. But it's changing. I mean, I have many examples changing away from serum going to a serum-free or xeno-free medium reduces the failure rate enormously. It's just because the composition of the medium is much more defined and stable and no variation batch to batch. So that's one key thing. But most companies wait very long with making it foolproof, and it's a pity.
Well, to me as a manufacturer, it's clearly provide robust, consistent products made by robust processes that work ever and ever again, including a lot of in-process controls to monitor the correct processing, correct manufacturing. It also means a decent characterization of the products to understand what they are doing. And this goes beyond the mere QC parameters, just having a product characterized, understand it, and then also monitor long-term stability to make sure everything is okay batch by batch. So this is key to provide foolproof solutions.
Yeah, and then I agree also that as we heard in the beginning, a lot of people try to get their process started, and they don't care too much about fine-tuning it, making it foolproof and all that. And this starts at a later stage. And I think the earlier you can get into that, at least partly, the better it is for you. And whoever has been in these presentations yesterday, we had a nice presentation of Truls Jordansen of Glycostem, who was showing us his fully closed system that they have developed. And they say as long as the operators do everything correctly, it's completely foolproof. It's exactly where they want it to be. But he also described the effort they had to put into that over time. So it's always that back and forth between the prevention of user errors and how much money, time you can invest to really get something together and go for your market authorization. So it's the old push that you have there. Another point when I pointed out that raw materials can help you reduce the cost of failure by making it foolproof. Can raw materials also help you overcome the shortage of labor that we see in manufacturing? Because we all know if the trend continues like this, there's a high demand on highly qualified people that can actually do cell therapy manufacturing. And the trend is, as we've seen from Glycostem, to go down with the qualification needed and make the system itself foolproof. Can a system like syringe, where you just inject something in there and you don't have to resuspend, or something else, would that help reducing also the cost of labor, or even make it possible to do cell therapy? Because even if you would be willing to pay a lot of amount of money for people, you can't find them.
Well, I certainly agree with the fact that the simplification of the process will reduce the need of knowledge and capacity of handling the different type of manufacturing. So for sure the answer is yes. Additionally, I will add one element that is coming up more and more, is that with all this fast track opportunity the new therapy have, we are in a situation when sometimes a product that have done just a early phase 2 is basically ready for commercial because it treats specific rare disease. So there will be a lot of therapy. They won't have the time to really develop the process. So I think if in the future provider like you can provide some solution that are very advanced and ready for commercial, it will somehow help in closing the gap that usually comes with the development. But many products, I think, in the future might not have the time to do it properly. So that will be interesting.
Correct. Yeah.
Don't think I've got much more to add. Obviously, packaging, to make sure that raw materials can be added to the process pretty easily. Again, easy to connect and the right concentration. It's just making sure the operator just has the easiest possible task. Because for those people that have been in GMP facilities and doing manufacturing, it's not a great working environment. And the easier you make their lives, the better for everyone, I think.
Yeah. If your well-trained technician spends an hour pumping 8 bottles into a bag, it's an hour lost. And in a previous life, Stefano and I have worked with a bioreactor company, and we've shown that just moving the process to a bioreactor saves 60% of labor time. Saving labor time also means that your teams are smaller, that you need less footprint to execute. So I think automation and pre-filled or pre-mixed things, they will speed up and reduce labor enormously.
Also talking about footprint, to jump in right there, if you're able to use some of these solutions and go down on your class of your clean room level on some processes, that also saves you a lot of operating costs, a lot of footprint for those things. It's not only the labor cost itself, but also maintaining all that. Sorry, Bernd, you had to add something to the last question? Or?
Well, from my perspective, an easy solution to reduce labor costs would be provide liquid reagents as opposed to freeze-dried. The disadvantage is stability, but we know many examples that are sufficiently stable. Second would be sterile attachment solutions, sterile connecting solutions, sorry. And third, I would mention, and here it's customizing again, pre-mixed mixtures of cytokines, mixtures of cytokine in the appropriate media. That's all possible. But you should be aware of this, it decreases flexibility, and the cell process should be fairly mature and stable and robust. And then it's definitely an excellent option.
Well, thank you so far. I would like to open this up to 1 or 2 questions from the audience, if we have any. I think we have a floating microphone somewhere, so if there are some questions, there's one over here, I see. I don't know, though, where the microphone is.
Great, actually, discussion. Quick question. In terms of packaging, you know, the packaging companies sometimes can be even more expensive than the product if you customize so much. So I think that actually the idea of the automation and being standardized within the community with the providers will be great, because actually the volume of packaging needed for these sterile opportunities, it's very small, and for the packaging company means nothing and becomes a little bit more expensive. So any comments on that particular subject?
Good question, thank you, and looking forward to these answers. Basically, are we large enough to even create interest from them? Do we have the critical mass yet to be heard?
Well, I can make the first attempt to address Claudia's question. I mean, of course, your comment is on the spot. I will say I relate to what Jef said at the beginning, that as of today, perhaps the solution that we as developer have in mind are perhaps can we customize a bag? So I will say that the customization of a bag is something expensive, but still feasible. What I think, what I start to think, based also on the discussion of today, is that most likely the right solution is not just the simple bag. So we will have to be creative in thinking what can be the right package, and perhaps the right package might fall in a niche where there is interest of this third party to be proactive. And I think we have seen, even in these days, companies, startups that decided just to start their business just to focus on the cell and gene therapy. So there is a hope that perhaps also the provider world of that specific solution might start to exist once we identify it, probably.
Yeah, I agree. We're still very young as an industry, and I think having startups that are innovative and come up with intelligent solutions, I think is really quite powerful in this space. Clearly, again, standardization is what we're after. It makes everyone's life so much easier if packaging and connections are standard. Yeah, I think that's just pretty much the way that we need to get to.
There was the word sustainability, and I don't want to make a political statement, but I hope the packaging industry is also up to date with what's going on outside, removing plastic from the shopping and making recyclable plastics degradable. I hope they're working on that, because if we grow, it's going to be a big burden on the...
Absolutely.
I find Claudia's comment absolutely true at this very moment, but I still believe what I said before, that customization is an issue for a mature product. At a mature product, maybe approaching licensing or maybe beyond, and when it comes to large number of pieces, large number of batches. And this automatically will increase the demand of the plastics or the consumables and drive down the price. Confident in that.
Yeah, standardization will do that. Do we have additional questions from the audience? Questions? Okay. Well, and that was a point I wanted to bring up too, that you brought up, Jef, where you say, okay, we're going to generate a lot of waste over time, and a lot of things are single use, all that. So are we, and this is definitely a political statement, are we able to also do something in a sustainable way looking forward? So you brought that point up already. Do the others have any idea about or any thoughts about that? Is that even something we should consider right now?
Well, personally, I think, yes, it should be kept in account, definitely. Especially because we are, in an industry where autologous is not that, might be the way forward for some of the therapy. So suddenly you might have like a production of dedicated batch or a commercial level, not only for, well, now we're talking about roughly 5 to 10 treatment for relatively rare disease, but it might be something more and more common. So if we don't think also on what remains as waste, we might enter in challenges as an industry, but I think we're going to impact also a lot of what is all the hospital management, perhaps in certain situation of the waste system, or also the, of the waste system of the municipality where we are. I mean, that's a reality. Mm-hmm. So it should be kept in account for sure.
And just to jump in here quickly with another data point from the Glycosem presentation yesterday, they said when they developed all their process and their facilities and everything, they totally underestimated the amount of waste they had to take care of in their own facilities, not even making sure it's disposed of correctly, but just putting it somewhere so it's not interfering. So that's also a consideration. Yep. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think right scale packaging as well. So rather than using lots of 1 litre bags of medium, maybe you can have your medium in a tote that can then be dispensed at the point of manufacturing, which would cut down a lot on the storage and packaging waste. And again, as we are far better able to forecast demand, then that makes that solution more attractive, I think.
I agree with Stefano that autologous is a problem to make a big change there, but in allogeneic, I'm a big advocate. If you move from cell stack to microcarriers in a bioreactor, you cut out 90% of the plastic as a start, the footprint, energy consumption. Moving from animal serotoxino-free, we know what animals cause on the planet, so that's easy. Allogeneic, I think there is a lot that can be done by just scaling up and then changing the process. Even in some regions, you even get subsidies, R&D subsidies if you make that step. But autologous is more difficult.
I can report similar experience from cytokine production as we are going more and more to disposable solutions. It definitely calls for much more space in terms of stocks of these materials and the waste. But also it saves energy, it saves a lot of energy. It saves a lot of waste of a different kind, like sodium hydroxide pollution, cleaning in place solutions, etc. So I'm not sure whether it's just more waste. I think it's also quite an ecological solution, could be.
Thank you. As we're coming to the close of this session, I would like each of you to give a quick answer to, if we have seen a lot of topics that are of importance to us. So if you pick one of those and you could solve that in 2020, one out for all, what would that be? What is for you the most important challenge to be solved, and how would you do that in 1 or 2 sentences?
Well, in my case, I feel a lot the pain of the regulatory aspect, in particular the fact that in Europe there's not something like DMF. I think that's a lack on our side of the ocean. So my hope is that will be something addressed in 2020.
So connectivity, and I think it may be the development of a working group for raw material providers to start working together to come up with just standardization around tube diameters, something pretty simple but could be quite effective.
Yeah. Well, you can't force people to communicate, but I think more communication between the parties will help a number of problems, as I said. Next to that, I agree with Stefano that more alignment between the regulatory bodies would really help everybody.
I came to the same. I would write a global guidance document, a regulatory document, and I would introduce drug master files in Europe, because I believe, and reduce the burden of responsibility from the manufacturers, because I believe the awareness of regulatory GMP quality is so different, and less as with the authorities. And if you introduce a drug master file system, more information gets disclosed than directly to the user.
Well, thank you, and I think with this we would come to the end of this session. I would say thank you to all of our participants for the very nice input. Thanks for the questions from the audience. And I would like to encourage everybody to get involved in these initiatives as much as you can and like, to drive all these initiatives forward that will help all of us in the industry to move forward and be prepared for the next 10, 20, 30 years where we will see tremendous growth. With this, I hope you enjoyed your breakfast, you enjoyed the briefing. I hope you have a last good day of the Phacilitate. And of course, I hope to see all of you again next year. Thank you very much. Thank you.